The camera flash went off for the 11th time that evening, and Maren Ellison still hadn't smiled the way she meant to. She stood on my back porch in the fading gold of a July evening, wearing a blue dress she'd bought that afternoon, specifically for this, turning her head this way, and that while I crouched below her with my phone held up like a man trying to photograph a nervous bird. Every photo looked the same, beautiful, technically, perfectly lit, perfectly framed, and utterly, devastatingly empty behind the eyes. I didn't know it yet, standing there with aching knees and a phone full of forced smiles, but that evening would become the hinge on which both our lives quietly turned. I didn't know that 6 weeks later I would be standing in a hospital corridor at 2 inches the morning, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, begging for one more chance to tell her what I should have said the very first night. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that my neighbor needed help taking pictures for a dating app, and I, for reasons I didn't fully understand even then, could not stop noticing the sadness she kept trying to smile through. If this story means something to you already, if you believe in second chances, in the quiet ways people save each other without ever meaning to do me a favor, before we go any further, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me you're here, share this with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists, and subscribe to Kindness Corner if you haven't already. It helps this story reach the people who need it most. Now, let's go back to that porch, because everything that mattered started there. Maren had moved in next door about 8 months before that evening, into the small blue house with the crooked mailbox that had sat empty for almost a year after old Mr. Hutchins passed. I remember watching the moving truck from my kitchen window, half curious in the way you are about new neighbors, half annoyed because I liked the quiet the empty house had given me. She was younger than I expected, maybe 34 or 35, with the kind of face that looked like it used to laugh easily and had simply forgotten how somewhere along the way. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, neighbors, exchange, borrowed sugar once, complained about the same aggressive squirrel that kept destroying both our gardens. Nothing more than that. I was 38, divorced 2 years, and had made something of a religion out of minding my own business and tending my tomatoes in peace. I wasn't looking for anything, and certainly not for whatever this would become. Then one Tuesday evening in early July, she knocked on my door holding her phone, like it was something that might bite her, and asked with an awkwardness that made my chest ache a little on her behalf whether I knew anything about photography. I told her I dabbled mostly landscapes, mostly for myself, nothing professional. She said that was more than enough because she needed someone to take some pictures of her for a dating profile, and she couldn't exactly ask her sister since her sister would just make it weird, and she didn't have close friends in town yet, and she'd noticed my camera equipment through the window once when I'd left the blinds open. And would I mind terribly? I should have felt strange about it. Looking back, I think some part of me did. But there was something so plainly lonely in the way she asked, so much quiet courage wrapped around an obvious embarrassment, that I said yes before I'd even fully considered it. We agreed on that Friday evening, when the light would be soft and forgiving. She showed up that Friday in the blue dress, hair done, a small collection of nervous energy radiating off her like heat off summer pavement. She explained, as I set up my tripod, that she'd been divorced for almost 3 years now, that her ex-husband had left for a coworker in a story so common it barely needs telling, and that she'd spent the years since throwing herself into her work as a hospital administrator, telling herself she didn't need anyone, until one day she woke up and realized she was 35 and hadn't been on a real date in longer than she cared to admit. Her sister had been the one to finally talk her into the dating app, insisting that Maren deserved to stop hiding behind spreadsheets and start living again. So here she was, on my porch, trying to capture a version of herself confident enough to attract someone worth attracting. The trouble was immediately obvious. Every photo I took showed a woman performing happiness rather than feeling it. Her smile was technically correct and emotionally hollow, the kind of smile you give a coworker in a hallway. Not the kind that belongs on a profile, meant to invite someone into your life. I took photo after photo, and photo after photo told the same quiet, sad story. Eventually, I lowered the phone and told her, as gently as I could, that the pictures weren't working because she wasn't actually there in them. She looked at me with something between offense and relief, like she'd been waiting for someone to say the honest thing out loud, and asked what exactly that was supposed to mean. I told her I meant that a camera doesn't just capture a face, it captures whatever a person is feeling underneath the face. And right now what I was capturing was a woman trying very hard to look like she wasn't sad. She was quiet for a long moment after that, looking out over my backyard toward the tree line, and then she admitted, in a voice much smaller than the one she'd used all evening, that she didn't know how to look happy anymore, because she genuinely couldn't remember the last time she'd felt it without having to manufacture it for someone else's benefit. She said this like it embarrassed her, like admitting to unhappiness was some kind of personal failure, rather than the simple, common ache it actually was. Something in me softened, in a way I wasn't prepared for. I put the phone down entirely and suggested we stop trying to photograph a version of her that didn't exist yet, and instead spend the evening actually talking. No camera, no performance. Just two neighbors on a porch. She hesitated, then agreed, and we sat there until well past dark, the porch light drawing moths while we talked about nothing important and everything important at the same time. She told me about growing up the daughter of a pastor in a small Ohio town, about how she'd spent her whole childhood being watched by an entire congregation, and had never quite lost the habit of performing for an audience, even when no audience was watching. I told her about my divorce, about how my ex-wife Callie had left not for someone else, but simply because she'd realized somewhere along the way that she didn't want the same life I did, and how that kind of leaving is almost harder to grieve, because there is no villain to be angry at. Just two people who grew into different shapes. By the time she finally said goodnight and crossed the small strip of grass back to her own porch, something had shifted between us, subtle as a change in weather. I didn't examine it too closely. I told myself she was simply a neighbor I now understood a little better. And that was that. We tried the photos again, the following weekend. This time she laughed twice, real unguarded laughter, both times at something I said without trying to be particularly funny. And both times I made sure to catch it. Those two photographs, the ones with the real laughter in them, ended up being the ones she used for her profile. I remember the strange pang I felt handing them over, watching her scroll through them with something like genuine pleasure on her face, knowing those photographs of her real self would soon be seen by strangers who would decide, based on a few images and a few lines of text, whether they wanted to try to know her. I told myself the pang was nothing. I was wrong about that, though it would take me weeks to admit it. Over the following month, Maren and I fell into an easy rhythm of neighborly friendship that neither of us named as anything more than that. She'd come over some evenings to tell me about the dates she was going on, and I'd listen, and something in me would tighten a little. Every time she described a man who seemed decent, who seemed like he might be the one to finally make her feel the things she deserved to feel. There was the accountant, who talked exclusively about his fantasy football league. There was the divorced father of three who spent the entire dinner on his phone checking on his kids, which she found endearing rather than annoying, a detail that bothered me more than I wanted to examine. There was a teacher named Grant, who she saw 3 times, who seemed kind and steady, and who I found myself disliking with an intensity that embarrassed me privately. I want to pause here and be honest with you. The way I've tried to be honest through this whole story, because I think the honest parts are the ones that matter. I did not, in those weeks, admit to myself what was happening in my own chest. I told myself I was simply a good neighbor, a good listener, a friend helping a friend navigate a difficult re-entry into the world of dating after divorce. I told myself the tightness I felt when she mentioned Grant's name was nothing more than ordinary protective instinct, the kind you'd feel for any friend. I was, in the specific and painful way that only self-deceiving people can be, lying to myself with total conviction. It was Maren's sister, of all people, who first said the thing out loud that I hadn't allowed myself to think. Her sister, whose name was Dana, came to visit one weekend in late August, and I met her briefly when she and Maren were loading groceries into Maren's car. Dana looked at me for a long moment after Maren introduced us as simply the neighbor who'd helped with her photos, and then said, with the blunt confidence particular to older sisters, that she didn't understand why Maren was wasting time on dating apps, when there was apparently a perfectly nice, perfectly available man living 20 feet from her front door. Maren laughed it off, called her sister ridiculous, and the moment passed in a flurry of grocery bags and mild embarrassment. But I noticed, in the seconds before she laughed, a flicker of something crossing Maren's face. Something that looked almost like she'd been caught thinking the exact same thought, and hadn't expected to be found out. I didn't bring it up. Neither did she. We continued our porch evenings, our easy friendship, both of us apparently determined to pretend that nothing unusual was growing in the space between us. Then came the night that changed everything. Though it began as such an unremarkable evening that I almost didn't invite her over at all. It was a Thursday in early September, and I'd had a difficult day at work, the kind that leaves you hollowed out and craving nothing but silence. I was sitting on my porch with a glass of wine, not particularly wanting company, when Maren appeared at the edge of her yard looking similarly worn down. She'd had a date that evening, her first in almost 3 weeks, with a man she'd met on the app who seemed promising on paper. I asked, out of politeness more than genuine curiosity, how it had gone. She sat down on the porch step without being invited, which she'd never done before, and told me it had gone fine, technically. He was polite. He asked good questions. He walked her to her car afterward and didn't try anything inappropriate. By every reasonable measure, it had been a successful date. But she said this in a voice so flat, so utterly devoid of the animation she usually carried, that I found myself asking what was actually wrong. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening street. And then she said something I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. She said that she'd spent the entire date performing a version of herself that she thought a stranger would find appealing, laughing at jokes that weren't especially funny, asking questions she didn't especially care about the answers to, and that halfway through dessert she'd had the strange, vertiginous realization that she couldn't remember the last time she'd been fully, unguardedly herself with anyone who wasn't me. The words hung in the air between us for a long moment, and I felt something in my chest crack open, not painfully, but like a window being unlatched after a long winter. I asked her, carefully, what she meant by that. She turned to look at me directly, something brave and frightened in her expression, and said that she'd spent 2 months trying to build a version of herself attractive enough for strangers on an app, when the person she actually felt like herself around had been 20 feet away the entire time, and she didn't know what to do with that realization, except say it out loud and see what happened. I did not, in that moment, say anything smooth or cinematic. I did not have some perfectly prepared confession waiting in my chest. What I actually did was sit there in stunned silence for what felt like an embarrassingly long time, my heart hammering in a way it hadn't in years, while I tried to figure out whether she meant what I thought she meant. Finally, because the silence had stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer, I asked her directly whether she was saying what I thought she was saying. She laughed. A small, nervous, honest laugh, and said that yes, that was exactly what she was saying, and that she was fully prepared for me to tell her she'd misread everything and ruined a good friendship in the process. I told her she hadn't misread anything. I told her that I'd spent 2 months lying to myself about exactly the same thing, watching her get ready for dates with other men, and feeling something twist in my chest that I refused to name, and that if she was brave enough to say it out loud on my porch step on an ordinary Thursday evening, then I owed her the same courage. And then she said the line that would end up meaning everything. The line I still hear in my head on quiet evenings when the light through my kitchen window turns gold, the way it did that first night on the porch. She said, forget the app, forget the profile, forget the strangers, forget trying to become someone worth swiping right on. Take me out, just you. Just this. I want to tell you that everything from that point forward was simple, that we fell into an easy, uncomplicated romance and lived happily ever after, with no further trouble. But that isn't how real life works. And this is a true story, so I owe you the truth of what came next, including the parts that nearly broke us before they had the chance to make us whole. Our first real date, 3 days later, felt both entirely natural and strangely formal. The way it does when you're trying to court someone you already know intimately, as a friend. I took her to a small Italian restaurant across town, the kind with candles and wine bottles and a owner who remembered regulars by name, and for the first hour we were almost painfully polite with each other. Both of us aware that whatever this was carried higher stakes than an ordinary first date, because if it failed, it wouldn't just end a budding romance. It would end a friendship and a neighborly proximity that would be awkward to escape. But somewhere around the second glass of wine, the old ease between us returned, and by the end of the evening, we were laughing the way we always had. Except now, there was something underneath the laughter, some current of possibility that hadn't been there before. We dated in secret for the first few weeks, if you can call it secret when your houses share a property line, and any neighbor with functioning eyesight could see my car in her driveway some mornings. We weren't hiding exactly. We were simply protecting something new and fragile from the weight of other people's opinions and questions before we understood it well enough ourselves to answer them. Dana found out first, of course, delighted beyond measure and insufferably smug about having predicted it months earlier. My own sister, when I finally told her, laughed and said she'd been wondering when I'd finally noticed the obvious. The real trouble began in October, about 6 weeks into our relationship. When Maren started experiencing headaches, she initially dismissed as stress. She worked long hours at the hospital, dealt with more administrative pressure than any reasonable person should have to carry, and headaches seemed like an ordinary consequence of an unreasonable job. But the headaches worsened, and one evening in late October while we were sitting on my porch, the same porch where this entire story began, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her face going pale in a way that frightened me more than anything I'd witnessed in years, and said she couldn't see properly out of her left eye. I drove her to the emergency room myself, my hands shaking on the steering wheel in a way I hoped she didn't notice, and I sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room for 4 hours, while doctors ran tests I didn't understand and couldn't influence. When a doctor finally called me back, I learned that Maren had a mass near her optic nerve, one that needed further imaging to fully understand, and that surgery would likely be necessary depending on what those images revealed. I will not pretend to you that the following weeks were anything other than the hardest of my life. Harder, even than my divorce. Harder than anything I'd faced before. Maren, for her part, handled the news with a composure that both amazed and worried me, the composure of someone who'd spent her whole life performing strength for other people, and had simply redirected that same performance toward her own diagnosis. It was during those weeks, sitting beside her in waiting rooms and imaging centers, that I finally understood the true depth of what had grown between us. Because fear has a way of stripping away everything performative, and leaving only what's actually real. I was not performing concern for her. I was not managing an image of a supportive boyfriend. I was simply, entirely, terrified of losing someone who had become essential to my life in the space of a few short months, and there was no version of myself I could have constructed that would have made that fear smaller or more manageable. The surgery was scheduled for the 2nd week of November. The night before, she asked me to stay over, not for anything romantic, but simply because she didn't want to be alone with her own thoughts, and I understood completely, because I didn't want to be alone with mine either. We lay awake most of that night talking about everything and nothing, the way we had on that first porch evening, except now every word carried the particular weight of two people who understood exactly how fragile the ordinary moments of a life actually are. At some point in the darkness, she told me that whatever happened the next day, she wanted me to know that the 2 months we'd had together, however brief they might turn out to be, had given her more genuine happiness than the 3 years before it combined, and that she didn't regret a single evening of it, not the awkward photo sessions, not the porch conversations, none of it. I told her, and I meant this with everything in me, that we were going to have far more than 2 months, that I fully intended to annoy her with my presence for decades to come, and that she needed to hold on to that plan with everything she had, because I wasn't prepared to build a life around anything less. The surgery lasted almost 6 hours. I sat in a waiting room that had become disturbingly familiar to me by that point, watching the clock with an intensity that made the minutes feel like hours, and the hours feel like entire seasons of my life passing by. Dana flew in that morning and sat beside me for most of it, and somewhere around hour 4, when neither of us could stand the silence any longer, she told me something I didn't know, which was that Maren had confided in her, back before any of this began, back before the dating profile and the photographs and the porch conversations, that she'd started to feel invisible in a way that frightened her, like she was disappearing a little more each year into an identity built entirely around being useful to other people at work, and pleasant to other people in general, without any solid sense of who she actually was underneath all that usefulness and pleasantness. Dana said that whatever had happened between Maren and me in the months since, it had brought her sister back to life in a way she hadn't seen since before the divorce. And that regardless of what happened in that operating room, she wanted me to know that I'd already given her sister something enormously valuable, which was the simple, radical experience of being seen and wanted exactly as she was, without performance, without editing, without trying to become a more marketable version of herself for a stranger's approval. "I don't mind telling you," I cried in that waiting room, unashamed, while Dana sat beside me and let me. When the surgeon finally emerged, his expression giving nothing away in the practiced manner of someone who has learned not to telegraph outcomes in hospital corridors, I stood so fast, I nearly knocked over my chair. He told us the mass had been successfully removed, that early pathology suggested it was benign, though further testing would confirm that in the coming days, and that Maren had come through the surgery well and was already in recovery. I have never in my life felt relief the way I felt it in that moment. A physical wave of it that nearly buckled my knees, and Dana grabbed my arm to steady me, laughing and crying at the same time in that particular way families do, and terrible news finally turns into good news. I was allowed to see her a few hours later, once she'd woken from the anesthesia. She looked impossibly small in that hospital bed, her head partially bandaged, an IV line in her arm. And when her eyes found mine across the room, the first thing she did before saying anything at all was smile. Not the performed smile from that first evening on my porch. Not the technically correct expression she'd manufactured for a dating profile camera. A real one, unguarded, exhausted, and entirely her own. I walked over and took her hand, and she said, in a voice still thick with anesthesia, that she'd been dreaming about the porch. About the evening we sat there, and she finally told me the truth about the app, and about wanting something realer than what it could offer her. And she said she was glad that dream had been real too, because she wanted to go back to that porch as soon as possible and just sit there with me doing absolutely nothing remarkable at all. The pathology results came back clear a few days later. Benign, fully removed, no further treatment needed beyond routine monitoring. We celebrated that news the way you might expect two people to celebrate a second chance at an ordinary future. Quietly, gratefully, with tears and with a kind of tenderness toward each other that I don't think either of us had fully possessed before we'd been forced to imagine losing it. If this story has moved you at all, if some part of you recognized yourself in Maren's fear of disappearing into a performed version of herself, or recognized yourself in my slow, stubborn refusal to admit what was growing in my own heart until fear finally forced the truth out of both of us, I'd ask you to let us know. Comment below and tell us which part touched you most. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that second chances are real, that ordinary neighbors sometimes become extraordinary parts of each other's lives, and that it is never too late to stop performing happiness and start actually living it. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Kindness Corner, because stories like this one are the entire reason this channel exists. And before we close this story, I want to ask something special of you. If you've made it this far, if something in this story settled into your chest the way Maren's words settled into mine that Thursday evening on the porch, I want you to comment the word porchlight below. Just that single word. It'll be our way of knowing that this story found the people it was meant to find. The people who understand that the most important moments in life rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They simply arrive quietly, on an ordinary evening, in the space between two people who finally decide to stop pretending. It has been 8 months now since that surgery, and Maren and I still sit on that same porch most evenings, usually with nothing more remarkable happening than the sun going down and the same aggressive squirrel destroying whatever remains of our gardens. She deleted the dating app the week she got out of the hospital, not with any dramatic gesture, just a quiet tap of a button one evening while we sat together. And she told me afterward that it felt less like giving something up and more like finally closing a door she didn't need anymore because she'd already found what she'd been looking for the entire time, 20 feet from her own front door. Holding a camera and struggling to capture a happiness she didn't yet know how to name. We're getting married in the spring, in the backyard, on the same patch of grass where the moving truck once unloaded boxes into a stranger's new house, where two neighbors once stood making polite conversation about sugar and squirrels, never imagining what that ordinary beginning was quietly building toward. Sometimes, in the golden light of an evening, much like that first one, I take her photograph, not for any app, not for any stranger's approval. just because I want to remember exactly what real happiness looks like on the face of someone I love, unguarded and entirely her own. And every single time, without trying, without performing, she smiled.